The patrol ship Velakara was 3 days into a routine border sweep when its sensors found something that did not belong. Senior scanner operator Rintith stared at his display panel. He read the numbers twice, then he read them a third time because the first 2 readings had obviously been wrong. They were not wrong, Commander, he said slowly. I have a contact, Commander Balevu of the Vest Dominion patrol cruiser Velakara looked up from his navigation reports. Balevu was a broad-shouldered Vest with 3 pale eyes and a personality that leaned heavily toward boredom. Border patrols were boring. That was the entire point of them. The outer rim of Dominion space had not seen a real threat in over 200 years. Classification, he asked. That is. Rintith paused. That is the problem. Commander, I cannot classify it. Balevu set down his reports and crossed to the scanner station. He looked at the display. He saw a vessel moving on a heading that cut through Dominion claimed space. Its speed was within normal travel range. Its drive signature was unusual but not alarming. Its size, however, was something else entirely. Run it again, Balevu said. I have run it 4 times. The vessel was large, not just large. It sat in the mass range of a Dominion heavy carrier, which was the kind of ship that required a fleet yard and 4 full years to construct. Vest Dominion had 11 of them. They were the pride of the Imperial Navy. Every crew member aboard every one of those carriers had been hand-selected and trained for years, and whatever was out there matched that mass category alone, with no escort, no support ships, no fleet forming around it, no tender vessels, nothing. A ship that size traveling alone through open space made absolutely no sense by any known doctrine. Query the Galactic Registry, Balevu said. Rintith was already querying. The Galactic Registry was the largest vessel database in known space. Every ship from a 1-crew courier shuttle to a Dominion fleet carrier was required to register with it. Registration was not optional. The 5 major galactic powers enforced it together, so did all 11 of the mid-tier civilizations. The registry had records going back 600 years and contained entries for over 4 million registered vessels. The query returned in 3 seconds. No match found. Run it against. Physical description, Balevu said. Maybe the registry identifier is corrupted. Rintith ran it against the physical description. He searched by mass class, by drive signature type, by hull geometry, by every measurable parameter the scanner could give him. No match found. It doesn't exist, Rintith said. He did not mean it literally. The ship was clearly there on the display, solid and real. What he meant was that, according to the registry, the most complete catalog of spacefaring vessels ever assembled, this ship had never been built, never been registered, and never been encountered by any known civilization in 6 centuries of recorded galactic history. Balevu stood very still. Then he said, "Hail them." The communications officer sent a hail on every standard frequency, Dominion standard galactic trade tongue, the languages of the other 4 major powers, the 11 mid-tier languages, the standard emergency band that even pre-contact civilizations sometimes accidentally picked up. Silence answered him for 40 seconds, then a response came. It was in none of those languages. It was in something entirely new, short, hard-edged words, simple vowels and consonants arranged in patterns that the ship's translation matrix had never encountered. The system cycled through its full database, found no match in, flagged the audio file as unknown. Language no match in registry, record. Everything. Bellevue said quietly, get me sector command and get me intelligence. Right now. He watched the unknown ship. On the display, it did not slow, it did not speed up, it continued on its heading the way something moves when it has already decided that the space around it is its own. Sector command received Bellevue's report within the hour. It reached Admiral Sothan's desk. 40 minutes after that, flagged at Priority 1, which was a classification Sothan had never seen used in 32 years of active service. He read the report carefully, then he passed it to his chief intelligence analyst, a sharp and methodical vet named Cordla, and told her to find answers before the day was out. Cordla took the scanner data, the language recording, the mass readings, and the whole geometry analysis, and she spent 6 hours pulling them apart against every database Dominion intelligence had access to. The whole geometry gave her the first thread to pull. It was not in the registry, but it matched a design philosophy she recognized: flat and angular, extremely heavy plating layered over the forward sections, weapon ports that were set deep into the hull rather than mounted externally on pylons. It was a style of construction that said very plainly, we expect to absorb damage and we intend to keep functioning anyway. That philosophy had a name. It was called Fortress Doctrine. It was old. The Veth themselves had used it 3 centuries ago, before their shield technology advanced to the point where heavy armor became less necessary. Most modern spacefaring civilizations had moved away from fortress doctrine because modern shields were more effective per unit of energy than raw physical plating, but the ship's drive readings were wrong for fortress doctrine. Fortress doctrine. Ships were slow. This ship was not slow. Then the language analysis came back and Cordla went still. The xenolinguistics team had broken the audio into its base components and compared its structural patterns against a very old file in the archive, a pre-contact survey file, 61 years old. The language patterns were a match. The file described a pre-contact species assessed 6 decades ago. Carbon-based bipedal single planet civilization centered on the third world of a yellow dwarf star system in the outer arm. The species was classified at the time as early industrial with primitive rocketry and no faster-than-light capability. Intelligence ratings were moderate. Aggression metrics were high, which was not unusual for pre-space flight species. They fought each other often. The survey noted territorial and tribal, with significant cultural complexity, inventive in a rough and chaotic way. The scheduled reassessment had been set for 100 years from initial contact. It was still 40 years away. The species had a name in the file: humans. The planet was called Earth. Cathala read the 61-year-old survey report. She read the section that described their early rocketry. She read the assessment that put them at roughly 50 to 100 years away from reliable space travel at the time of survey. She read the final recommendation: observe from distance. No direct contact warranted. Reassess in approximately 1 century. Then she looked at the scanner readings again. 4.1 km. Long drive systems that were clearly FTL capable, weapon ports that she could count at least 40 of from the scan data. Alone shields, the scanner had detected what appeared to be multiple in-depth and dense shielding systems running simultaneously, which was not how any known civilization built shields. 61 years. In 61 years, the species had gone from early rockets to that. Thala filed her report immediately. At the bottom, she added a personal note. She was not someone who added personal notes to official reports. She had never done it before. The note read, "I strongly recommend we treat this contact with the same seriousness we would extend to a recognized major power. The development timeline here is not normal. We do not know what else they have built." Admiral Sothvin read Thala's report. He also read her personal note, which he found slightly dramatic. He understood her concern. A pre-contact species developing FTL-capable ships in 60 years was unusual. He did not dismiss it, but he was a practical man with 32 years of experience dealing with practical problems, and the practical reality was this one synth ship, however large and however unexpectedly capable, was still one ship. No registered civilization, no treaty, no recognition by any galactic council, no diplomatic standing, no allies who would protest if the Dominion acted. The humans were legally and politically nothing, a primitive species that had built one impressive vessel and wandered into Dominion territory without permission. Sothan looked at his available forces. He had 12 warships currently at Vel Sector Command, 3 heavy cruisers, 9 destroyers, all combat rated, all crewed by trained Dominion Navy personnel. He assembled them into a formation he designated Battle Group Velakish and placed them under the command of Commodore Drethin, a veteran officer with 27 years of service and a record of 2 actual combat engagements, both of which he had handled cleanly. The orders were clear: intercept the unregistered vessel, demand it halt and submit to inspection. If it refused, disable it by minimum necessary force and bring it in. Drethin received his orders, acknowledged them, and led Battle Group Velakish out of the station. Sothan returned to his desk. He had other matters to handle on the unregistered ship, whose actual name was the ESV Reckoning, a designation that appeared on no Dominion chart. Captain Yara Chen was informed of the incoming intercept force while she was still working through her morning coffee. She was 43 years old. She had spent 19 of those years in the Terran Defense Command, which was an organization that the Galactic Registry did not know existed. She had short dark hair that she kept practically cut, a habit of absolute stillness when she was thinking, and the specific kind of calm that comes not from a lack of imagination but from having already imagined every bad outcome and made peace with most of them. She set her coffee down and looked at the tactical display. 12 ships, 3 heavies, 9 destroyers closing at standard intercept speed. Log the contact, she said. Flag it to command with full scanner data. Mark our position. Yes, Captain. Lieutenant Quame Assant, her tactical officer, was already working. Orders continue on course and heading. Assant looked at her. He had served with her for 4 years, and he knew her well enough not to question her orders out loud very often. He did it now. We're holding course toward 12 warships. We are in open space. We have not fired on anyone. We have taken no hostile action. She picked Up her coffee again, we will hear what they have to say when they choose to say it. Until then, we have a patrol to run. The reckoning had been in this region. For 6 days, it was mapping gravitational anomalies along the outer arm, a task that command had decided was worth doing, and other fact that a local power claimed this region as its territory was a matter that Earth's diplomatic office was still discussing. At a level far above Captain Chen's rank, what was not above her rank was her ship and her crew. She trusted both of them completely. She drank her coffee and watched the 12 ships approach. Commodore Drethan sent his first communication 40 minutes out. Standard intercept protocol. Identify yourself. State your registry number. Explain your presence in Dominion space. He sent it on all standard frequencies. The response came back in that unknown language first, then a second message followed, this one in Galactic trade tongue, which meant the ship had a functional translation system and had simply chosen not to use it the first time. The message said, "This is Captain Yara Chen of the Earth Space Vessel, reckoning on assigned patrol under Terran Defense Command Authority. We have committed no hostile action. We are transiting uncontrolled space on a navigation survey. State your authority for this intercept and identify your command." Drethan read it carefully. He noted the phrase uncontrolled space, which was not how anyone described Dominion territory. He noted Terran Defense Command, which appeared in no intelligence file. He noted the word survey, which suggested a routine mission, and he noted the calm, direct tone, which suggested a captain who was not particularly worried about the 12 warships coming toward her. He responded, "You are operating in Veth Dominion space without registration or permission. You will halt immediately. You will submit your vessel to inspection. Failure to comply will be treated as a hostile act." The reply from the reckoning took 50 seconds. "We do not recognize the claimed territorial authority over this region. We have not consented to inspection by an unrecognized party. This is our final communication on this topic. If your vessels enter weapons range, we will respond appropriately. This is your only warning." Commodore Drethan read it twice. He noted that she had called him Commodore, which meant she had read his IFF signal and identified his rank. He noted final communication, which was the phrasing of someone who had made a decision and was done discussing it. He noted, "We will respond appropriately," which was the calmest threat he had ever received from any vessel facing a force 12 times its number. He looked at the reckoning on the tactical display. It had not changed course. It had not changed speed. No weapon systems had powered to active status as far as his scanners could determine. No shields had visibly shifted configuration. It sat there on its heading, as solid and unhurried as a mountain. Drethan had 27 years of experience reading enemy commanders. He knew the difference between a bluff held by someone who was frightened and a position held by someone who was not. He knew the difference between aggressive posturing and genuine confidence. He looked at that ship on his display for a long moment. Then he pushed Battle Group Velketh forward, because he had his orders and because 12 warships did not stop for one, and because whatever she was still only one captain on one ship. He would know soon enough what kind of captain she was. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that Yara Dechen had already run the tactical numbers 4 times since the intercept force appeared on her display, and that every run had come out the same way, and that the reason she was calm was not that she was bluffing, she simply knew something Commodore Drethen did not. The Reckoning had not been built to run. Commodore Drethen was not a careless man. He had served in the Veth Dominion Navy for 27 years, and he had learned early that carelessness in space was a very quick way to stop serving in anything at all. He had fought in the Recton skirmish in the Outer Belt conflict. He had lost ships in both. He had won both. He knew how to read a tactical situation, and he knew how to control his own reactions when a situation was unclear. The situation was unclear. He sat in the command chair of his flagship, the heavy cruiser Veldorn, and he watched the reckoning on his tactical display, and he thought very carefully about what he was seeing. The ship had not moved from its course. It had not powered weapons to active status. His scanner team had gone over it thoroughly during the approach and found weapon ports, yes, many of them. But they were not hot, they were not charged. The energy signature of the ship's power grid showed no surge toward combat systems. It looked for all practical purposes like a ship that was simply traveling and had no intention of doing anything else, which was what made Drethen uncomfortable, because a ship that saw 12 warships approaching and did nothing at all was either very stupid or very confident, and nothing about the construction of the Reckoning. Just its builders were stupid. Commodore, his tactical officer, Subcommander Velta, spoke without looking up from her station. We are entering the outer range of their listed weapon ports, reduced to 1-4 approach speed. Drethen said, formation tight. Shields to full. The battle group slowed. 12 ships pulled in closer to each other, a standard formation for a confrontation. Shields on all 12 vessels. Powered to maximum output. The energy cost was significant. Drethen preferred significant energy cost too. Significant casualties. One more hail. He said, final offer. The message went out. Unknown vessel, this is your last opportunity to comply. Halt immediately. Power down all weapon systems. Stand by for boarding. If you do not comply, within 60 seconds we will open fire. He watched the timer run. The Reckoning did not halt. It did not power down. It also did not power up. It simply continued on. Its heading slow and enormous, like something that had not heard him. The 60 seconds expired. Drethen took a breath. All ships target their engine section. Weapons free. Captain Chen heard the firing order come in from her signals officer exactly 0.3 seconds before her own sensors detected the weapon discharges from the Dominion formation shields. She said that was all she said. The Reckoning side shield grid came up at full power across all 4 layers simultaneously. The energy draw was enormous. It dropped the lights slightly in every non-essential corridor on the ship, but it came up fast because the engineers who had designed it had built it to come up fast, because the people who had approved the design had read enough military history to know that the gap between threat detected and first shot fired was often measured in fractions of a second. The first Dominion volley hit the outer shield layer in the Dominion Navy. A heavy cruiser's primary weapons were plasma lances, focused beams of superheated ionized gas that could burn through standard shielding in 3, 2, 4 sustained hits against a single layer shield. A simultaneous barrage from 3 heavy cruisers would have disabled most vessels immediately. The Reckoning had 4 shield layers. Outer layer took the barrage it held. The energy reading spiked hard, but the layer did not fail. The sensors registered the hits as significant. Impacts distributed the load across the field and reported back. Outer layer at 71% integrity, all inner layers nominal. On the bridge, nobody said anything. Dramatic, Lieutenant Assant called out the shield readings, the damage control officer, Chief Warrant Officer Priya Mehta, was already looking at the numbers. The helm officer adjusted. Nothing, because there was nothing to adjust yet. Chen looked at the tactical display. 12 ships, 3 heavies at the center of the formation, 9 destroyers arranged around them in a covering pattern, there to handle any return fire from lighter weapons and to pursue if the target ran. They had set the formation up perfectly for a target that was going to run ahead. 1-3, Chen said, right into them. The helmsman, a young lieutenant named Torres, who had been on his first deep space deployment when he joined the Reckoning's crew and was now on his fourth, took the ship forward without blinking toward the formation, not away from it. Primary rail drivers, Chen said, target the lead heavy drive section. Rail drivers charging. Assant said, targeting the Veldorn drive section. Solutions locked. Fire. The sound of a rail driver firing was not a sound that anyone inside the Reckoning felt much. There was a low vibration through the deck that a person could feel in their boots, a slight tremor that ran from the bow to the stern. That was all. What happened on the other end was different. A 12-ton tungsten slug accelerated to 11% of the speed of light, hit the Veldorn's engine section at a vector that the Dominion cruiser shields had not been designed to handle. Dominion shields were very good against energy weapons. They were built to absorb plasma, deflect particle beams, and disperse laser light. They were the standard of the galactic mainstream technology that had been refined over 200 years and optimized against the weapons that most galactic civilizations used, because most galactic civilizations had developed similar weapons along similar lines. A 12-ton kinetic projectile at 11% light speed was not an energy weapon. It was mass, pure mass, moving very, very fast. The Veldorn shields registered the incoming object as a physical mass rather than an energy discharge and attempted to adapt. They partially succeeded. The slug was slowed, but partially was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because even slowed, a 12-ton object at that velocity carried energy that the shield mathematics simply could not fully account for. It hit the drive section. The Veldorn lurched hard to port. The entire rear quarter of the ship went dark as the drive core registered catastrophic damage. An emergency system shut it down automatically to prevent a secondary explosion. The ship spun slowly, venting drive plasma from 3 separate ruptures along its aft hull. Commodore Dreth had been thrown from his command chair. He got up from the deck, grabbed the armrest, pulled himself back upright, and looked at his display. His ship's engines were gone. He was drifting. The Reckoning was still moving toward his formation. All ships open fire, he said. His voice was very steady, which he was quietly proud of, and concentrate on their forward. Shields, continuous fire, do not stop. The next 4 minutes were the longest 4 minutes of Dreth's life. The 9 Dominion destroyers poured everything they had into the Reckoning's forward. Shields, plasma lances, particle beams, short-range missiles, the 2 functional heavy cruisers, the Velsar and the Velketh, added their primary weapons to the barrage. The energy being put into those shields was, by any reasonable calculation, enough to disable a Vel 3 times the Reckoning's size. The Reckoning's this outer shield layer failed, the second layer held, and while the formation poured fire into the shields, the Reckoning continued to work through its target list methodically. It fired its primary rail drivers 4 more times in those 4 minutes. Each shot was aimed at a specific system on a specific ship, not at the crew spaces, not at the reactor cores, at the engines, the weapons, the communication arrays. Precise, deliberate shots at components that the Reckoning's intelligence suite had mapped during the approach phase, when the ship had been quietly scanning the Dominion formation the entire time. It appeared to be doing nothing at. The second heavy cruiser, the Velsar, took a rail slug through its primary weapon array. The array did not explode. It simply ceased to function, destroyed so completely that explosion was not really an option. The third heavy cruiser, the Velketh, took a shot through its shield generator housing. Its shields collapsed completely. It went from full defensive capability to nothing in under a second. 3 destroyers were struck in their maneuvering systems. They could still move, but they could not maneuver with any precision. They drifted, unable to hold formation. The Dominion ships kept firing. They could not stop. Stopping felt like surrender, and surrender felt like death. They poured everything into the Reckoning shields, and the Reckoning shields absorbed it, and the Reckoning kept moving. Second shield layer at 40%, Asant reported. His voice was professionally level. Third layer standing by. Good, Chen said. How many of theirs are still maneuvering? 6 destroyers. Functional, 2 heavies with degraded systems. Veldorn still disabled. Missile battery, Chen said. I want the 6 functional destroyers rolling. Fire, start from the farthest and work in. Yes, Captain. The Reckoning's missile batteries had been quiet until now. They opened up. The destroyers had point defense systems. Every modern warship had point defense systems. They were designed to handle missiles, which were slower than rail slugs and which gave the defense more time to respond against a normal missile barrage. Destroyers' point defense was reliable. The Reckoning fired 64 missiles in rolling waves of 8. The pattern was designed specifically to overwhelm point defense timing. Waves spaced closely, enough that destroying one wave left the defense tracking the next before it could reset. The firing pattern had been developed by Terran Defense Command engineers who had spent years studying and stress testing their own point defense systems in exactly this scenario. The first destroyer's point defense handled the first wave. It handled the second wave. It was still processing the third wave when the fourth wave hit its starboard engine pod. The destroyer went dark on the Valdorn, drifting and powerless. Commodore Dreth and watched his tactical display and tried to find an option that he had not already considered and discarded. There were none. He had begun this engagement with 12 ships, 6 Minutes in, he had one heavy cruiser. With no shields, two partially functional heavy cruisers, and 5 destroyers that could still maneuver. The Reckoning had lost one shield layer, and had not slowed, had not changed course, and showed no sign of damage to any critical system. It was still firing. Another destroyer went dark as he watched, point defense overwhelmed, engine pod destroyed, crew alive but ship dead in space. Drethan looked at his communications panel. He had 2 options. He could order the remaining ships to scatter, break formation, run in 6 different directions, force the Reckoning to choose targets, and hope that some of them survived, or he could issue a general distress call to Sector Command and accept that this engagement was over. He looked at the Reckoning on the display. It was still coming toward them. It had not stopped to finish off the disabled ships. It was not wasting fire on ships that were already out of the fight. It was moving through his formation like it had a list, and it was working through the list in order. Whoever commanded that ship was not angry. They were not panicking. They were not trying to prove a point. They were simply completing a task. Drethan keyed his communications. All ships, all ships, this is Commodore Dreth. He paused. Break formation, scatter in, run, do not attempt to reform, get to the station and report. Then he keyed Sector Command, Valdorn to Sector Command, priority emergency, battle. Group Valketh is combat ineffective. Engaging unknown vessel, request immediate assistance. He gave their position. He gave the Reckoning's position. He sat back in his chair. The Reckoning watched his ship scatter on the display. It did not chase them. It let them go. It held its position in the middle of the wreckage of his battle group, enormous and undamaged in any meaningful way, and it sat there in space the same way it had sat before the battle began, like it had all the time in the world. Like 12 warships had been a minor inconvenience. Dreth had been in the Dominion Navy before 27 years, and he had seen many things. He had never seen anything like this. He did not have the words for what he had just experienced. He sat in his powerless, drifting flagship, and he waited for rescue, and he thought about the captain of that ship, calm and unhurried, working through her target list with the patience of someone who had already known how it was going to end. The distress call went out. Sector Command would hear it in 7 hours. What came after that Dreth could not predict. He knew one thing. He knew that whoever decided what came after that needed to know that this was not a single impressive ship piloted by a lucky captain. What he had just seen was doctrine. Practiced, refined, deliberate doctrine. Every firing solution, every target priority, every timing decision, it had been done before, maybe not against Dominion ships, but done before against something. He pulled up his personal log and began to record what he had witnessed in as much detail as he could remember, while the details were still sharp, because Sector Command was going to need to understand what was out there, and he was going to make sure they did. The distress call from Battle Group Vel Cath reached Vel Sector Command Station at 3:14 station time, when most of the senior staff were asleep. Admiral Sofin was not the kind of man who slept heavily. He had spent too many years in the Navy for that. The alert pulled him awake at full clarity within seconds, and by the time his aide reached his quarters, he was already dressed. He read the initial distress message in the corridor on the way to the command Center, then he read it again. Battle. Group Velkath is combat ineffective 12. Ships 3 heavy cruisers 9. Destroyers combat ineffective. Those were the words Dreth had used, not destroyed, not retreating, ineffective. Which meant the battle was not still ongoing, the battle was over. It had been 6 hours since Dreth had deployed. Sothan walked faster. The command center was fully staffed by the time he arrived. The night watch had already called in the day watch early. The main display showed the last known position of battle group Valkyrie and the unknown vessel. The position data was 7 hours old by the time it reached the station Shen, because that was the light lag on the transmission from that distance. 7 hours ago his 12 ships had been combat ineffective. He had no information about what had happened in the 7 hours since. Cordula was already at her station. She had been there from the look of her since before the alert. She looked at Sothan when he entered, and her expression was the expression of someone who had been right about something and was not finding any satisfaction in it. Get me everything from the distress package, Sothan said. Full data dump. Already processing, Cordula said. Dreth attached his personal log, full combat record, scanner data from the Veldorn for the entire engagement. That was thorough. That was exactly the kind of thing a good officer did when he knew he was going to be sitting in a disabled ship with nothing else to do and a story that people needed to hear correctly. Sothan sat down at the main console and opened Dreth's combat record. He watched it in silence for 22 minutes. When it ended, he sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Get me the Emperor's office." The data reached the Imperial capital Velshan Prime in 14 hours. By that time Sothan had also received confirmation from 3 of the surviving destroyers that had made it back to communication range. Their accounts matched Dreth's record exactly. At Velshan Prime, the Imperial Council met in emergency session. This was not a routine thing. The Imperial Council met in full emergency session when something's happened that nobody had a pre-existing plan for. It had met 8 times in the last 300 years. This was the 9th time. The council chamber was a large oval room with walls that were traditionally kept bare to prevent distraction. 12 council members sat around the central table. The Emperor Velkath IV sat at the head. He was old, older than most of the council, and he had been emperor for 40 years, which meant he had seen a great many things that had seemed unprecedented and had turned out in retrospect to be manageable. He was listening to the combat data with the expression of a man who was not yet sure whether this was manageable. The chief military advisor, General Torthan, finished his briefing. He had presented the numbers without embellishment because embellishment was not necessary. The numbers were sufficient on their own. 12 warships, 1 engagement, duration 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, 5 ships destroyed, 6 disabled and unable to maneuver, 1 heavily damaged but retreating, 0 casualties on the unknown vessel. Unknown vessel continued on original heading after the engagement and had not been tracked since 11 minutes. 1 ship, said council member Valoro, who oversaw military procurement and had overseen the construction of 2 of those heavy cruisers. 1 ship did this to a full battle group in 11 minutes. Yes, General Torthan said. Ship we have no record of, no record in the registry, no record in intelligence. files, and no record in any database we have access to, including the archives of the other 4 major powers which we contacted in the last 6 hours. None of them have a match for this vessel. The council chamber was quiet. The species. The Emperor said, the humans, what do we know about them now? Ordla had been brought to the capital for this session, which was unusual. She was an intelligence analyst, not a council presence. She had been brought because she had been right and because the Emperor preferred, at moments like this, to hear from the person who had been right. She stood and addressed the council based on what we observed in the engagement. I can tell you several things. Her voice was level. First, the weapons technology, the primary armament, was a kinetic projectile system, very large mass objects accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. We have never encountered this as a primary weapon system because the engineering requirements to do it well are very difficult, and because most civilizations that develop it eventually replace it with energy weapons. The humans appear to have retained it and refined it significantly. It bypasses energy shields almost entirely, which is a significant problem for us because all of our defensive doctrine is built around energy shields. Nobody said anything. Second, the shielding. The human ship appeared to have multiple independent shielding layers running on different physical principles. When one layer was degraded, the next layer held independently. Our weapons were effective against their outer shielding, but we ran out of time to work through the remaining layers. This is not standard engineering. This represents either a fundamentally different approach to shield design or a significantly more advanced one. Possibly both. Still nobody spoke. Third and most important, keyword. Lapels the combat behavior. I have reviewed Commodore Drethen's record 4 times. Every firing solution was precise. Every target priority was deliberate. The ship targeted systems rather than crew. It did not chase retreating vessels. It completed its objectives and stopped. This is not the behavior of a crew that discovered they were in a fight and reacted. This is practice doctrine. They have done this before. They trained for this specific scenario. The Emperor looked at her. They trained to fight 12 warships with one ship. They trained to fight a superior numerical force with a single vessel. Yes, the tactical pattern is consistent with what we call, what our own doctrine calls, outnumbered engagement doctrine, but their version is more developed than ours, much more developed. General Thornton said, if they trained for it, they expected it would happen. Yes, Cordla said, which means they knew about us before we knew about them. That is the conclusion I reach. Yes. The Emperor looked at the ceiling of the council chamber for a long moment. He was thinking. Everyone waited. The ship entered Dominion space on a patrol route, he said finally. That is what Drethen called it in his report. Patrol route, not an exploration mission, not a first contact approach. Patrol, yes, which means there are other routes, other ships on other routes. That is the logical conclusion. We sent one battle group, the Emperor said very quietly, and it was not enough. If we had sent more, if we had sent everything at Vel Sector Command, would it have been enough? Cordla did not answer immediately. She had thought about this question before the session. She had run numbers. She had looked at the scanner data from the engagement and Extrapolated, I don't know, she said. Honestly, I don't have enough data to tell you. What I can tell you is that our weapons were having a measurable effect on their shielding. With enough ships firing for long enough, we would have eventually degraded their defenses, but I don't know how long that would have taken. I don't know how well they can repair shields under fire. I don't know what other systems they have that we haven't seen, and I don't know how many of our ships would have survived long enough to finish the task. The room was very quiet. Find out, the Emperor said. Find out everything. I want every intelligence resource we have pointed at. This, I want to know where they live. I want to know how many ships they have. I want to know how long they have been out here without us noticing. I want to know everything about them before we make any further decisions. He looked around the table, and no further military action, not one more ship sent toward that vessel or toward anything connected to these humans, not until I say otherwise. Is that understood? Every head at the table nodded. Sothan, attending the session remotely from Vel Sector Command, nodded as well. He was thinking about Dreth and sitting in a disabled ship and watching the reckoning hold its position after the battle, not pursuing, not threatening, just waiting. He was starting to think that waiting was something that humans were very good at. Koedlo worked for the next 72 hours. With almost no sleep, she had resources. Now, the Emperor had opened every intelligence database, every archive, every file from every agency that had ever filed a report about any region of the outer arm. She had analysts working in shifts. She had the cooperation of the 4 other major galactic powers, each of whom had been told enough of the situation to take it seriously and had shared their own outer arm survey data. Without argument, the picture that assembled itself over those 72 hours was not comforting. The first thing she found was Earth itself. The planet was exactly where the 61-year-old survey file said it would be. She found it using long-range passive sensors, which could detect a planet but could not give detailed information. What the passive sensors could tell her was that the system was active. There was a great deal of energy output from the 3rd planet. There was a smaller signature from the 4th planet. There was activity in the asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th planets that had the signature of mining operations. They had multiple installations in their own system. The second thing she found, and this took more work, was the infrastructure around Earth system. Shipyards. She was fairly certain she was looking at shipyards based on the energy signatures and the mass readings from long-range scan. She could not count them precisely. She could estimate. The estimate was not a small number. The third thing she found was the patrol patterns. It took her team 36 hours to piece this together from scattered data, anomalous sensor contacts over the past decade that had been filed as equipment errors, unusual drive signatures that border patrols had logged and not followed up on, trace readings that hadn't matched anything in the registry and had been dismissed as background noise. Her analysts pulled every one of these incidents and mapped them on a chart. The chart showed paths, regular, overlapping paths run on cycles that repeated with slight variations. Survey routes, observation routes, the pattern of a civilization that had been quietly mapping everything around it for years. The humans had been in and out of Dominion space for at least a decade. Possibly longer. They had been careful. They had not fired on anything. They had not made contact. They had stayed at the edges of sensor range and watched and recorded and gone home. They had been studying the Dominion, and then one of their ships had taken a patrol route that ran a little deeper into Dominion space than usual, and Bellevue had better sensors than the previous patrols had accounted for, and the reckoning had been found. Cordella looked at her chart. For a long time, the humans had seen them first. They had decided, for reasons she did not yet understand, not to announce themselves. They had watched and waited and built, and they had kept doing it for at least a decade, probably longer. They had built ships large enough to handle full battle groups alone. They had trained crews for exactly the kind of outnumbered engagement that battle group Velikath had given them. They had been ready. She wrote her report. It was the most important report she had ever filed. She laid out everything she had found, every piece of evidence, every conclusion, and every gap in her knowledge that she could not fill with current data. At the end she wrote, "We do not know what the humans want. We do not know why they chose not to make contact. We do not know whether the engagement with battle group Velikath was the response they intended to give when they were found, or whether it was a deviation from a larger plan. We know very little. What we know is this: they were ready. Whatever our next step is, we should proceed as though we are dealing with an equal power at minimum. The assumption that we are dealing with a minor species that built one impressive ship must be abandoned completely." She filed a report and went to find something to eat. In the corridor outside her office, she stopped at the window and looked out at the stars. One of those stars, somewhere out there, was a yellow dwarf with a small blue planet orbiting it, a planet full of people who had looked at the galaxy 60 years ago and decided, apparently, that they were not ready to introduce themselves yet. She wondered what they had been waiting for. She wondered if they were still waiting, or if Battle Group Velikath had ended that particular period of patience. She hoped, with a feeling she did not usually allow herself in professional contexts, that the humans were reasonable people. The alternative was a thing she did not want to think about too carefully. The Emperor read Cordula's second report in his private study, alone at a time when the palace was quiet. He read it twice. Then he put it down on his desk and sat with it for a long time. He was 81 years old. He had been emperor for 40 years. Before that, he had been a military officer, and before that, a student of history. He had read about every major event in Dominion history, and quite a few events from the histories of other civilizations. He had seen wars start. He had seen them end. He had seen civilizations rise and collapse. He understood in the deep way that only old men with long memories truly understand how badly things could go wrong. He looked at the key numbers in Cordula's report. The humans had been operating in Dominion space, observed, but undetected, for at minimum 10 years. Probably longer. The patrol pattern showed sophistication that took years to develop. The shipyard signatures around their home systems suggested a construction capacity that was, by Cordula's careful estimate, comparable to a mid-tier galactic civilization, not a minor species, not a primitive culture. With one impressive ship, a civilization with serious industrial capacity, dedicated to building warships, and they had been doing it in silence. The Emperor thought about that. He thought about the choices that required a civilization capable of large-scale warship construction, sitting quietly for decade after decade, watching the galaxy, not announcing itself. That required discipline. That required a shared national will or something like it. That required leadership that had looked at the galaxy and made a conscious decision. Not yet, we are not ready yet. What were they waiting until they were ready? For he called coordinator directly. It was late, but she had told her staff she was available at any hour for his office. She answered on the second signal. The psychological assessment, he said without preamble. You included a section on there. Historical character, tell me more. Coordinator had anticipated this question. She had a file open already. The survey records from 61 years ago were limited, but they gave us a starting point. The humans were at the time of assessment a highly fragmented species. Many separate nations, many separate governments, constant conflict between them, high aggression, high territorial instinct, but also high cooperation within groups. They were capable of very large-scale organized effort when they felt a sufficient threat or a sufficient shared goal. They unified, the Emperor said, not entirely, from what we can reconstruct. They did not eliminate their internal divisions, but they appear to have reached some form of sufficient consensus around space development and specifically around the question of how to engage with potential external powers. The fact that they maintained a decade of operational silence across what must have been multiple governments and administrations suggests a level of strategic patience that we would not normally associate with high aggression species. Their own history, the Emperor said. Their wars, tell me about those. They have been at war with themselves in various forms for as long as their recorded history exists. They have developed weapons and tactics and counter-tactics and counter-counter tactics in continuous cycles for thousands of years. Their military history is extremely long and extremely detailed. By the time they reached early space flight, they had been refining the science of conflict longer than they. Dominion has existed as a political entity. The Emperor was quiet. That is why the weapons are so good, he said. That is part of it, yes. The kinetic projectile system is not new physics. It is an old concept applied with engineering precision that comes from a very long time spent thinking very hard about how to defeat defensive systems. Their shield design, the layered independent system, shows similar thinking. They did not invent a better shield. They invented a system that fails gracefully. When one layer goes down, the battle does not chain dramatically because the next layer is already working. They thought about what happens when things go wrong, and they built for it. The Emperor picked up the report again. He looked at the shipyard estimate. How many ships do we think they have? The honest answer is that we don't know. The shipyard signatures tell us capacity. They don't tell us how long those yards have been running, at what production rate. The reckoning appears to be a large vessel. We estimate it as being in their heavier categories based on its mass. If they have been producing ships for the past 20 years at a rate consistent with the yard signatures, the number could be. She paused. Significant. How significant? Hundreds of ships at the reckoning's class, likely more smaller vessels. We're estimating based on very limited data, and I want to be clear that the margins of error on these numbers are very wide, but the lower end of our estimate is still a fleet that would challenge the full Dominion Navy in open engagement. The Emperor put the report down again, and the upper end. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. The upper end is a fleet that does not challenge the full Dominion Navy, she said carefully, because it exceeds it. The four other major galactic powers received carefully worded briefings. Within the week, the Dominion did not share everything. Coordinators' full report was kept at the highest classification, but they shared enough. A new spacefaring species, advanced military technology, and engagement. The Outer Rim, the responses were instructive. The Keth Collective, who controlled a large block of territory in the Eastern Arm, sent a reply within 6 hours. They wanted to know everything immediately and offered to share their own outer arm sensor data in exchange. The fact that they had outer arm sensor data they had not previously shared was itself interesting. The Preth Alliance sent a reply that was polite and vague. They said they would investigate. They said nothing else for 3 days and sent a second message saying they had found minor anomalous contacts in their own border regions over the past several years that they had attributed to equipment error. They were now reconsidering that attribution. The Solani theocracy sent a religious delegation and asked whether the humans had been assessed for spiritual compatibility with the Solani faith. This was less immediately useful. The Drac Federation, the smallest of the 5 major powers, sent a very short message. It said, "We have been tracking this species for 4 years. We did not report it because we assumed everyone else was also tracking them and had reached the same conclusion we reached. Have you not been tracking them?" Coordinator read the Drac message and felt a specific kind of annoyance. What conclusion? She demanded of the Drac liaison in the next communication. The conclusion that they were preparing for contact on their own terms and had not chosen to initiate yet, and that interfering with that process before they were ready was inadvisable. Drac liaison said he was a calm, compact individual with large eyes and a manner of speaking that made everything sound slightly obvious. We assessed that forcing contact prematurely would produce a worse outcome than waiting for them to approach us voluntarily. We assumed this was the consensus position of the major powers. There was no consensus position. Cordelia said, "Ah," said the Drac liaison, "that explains the battle group." Cordelia closed the channel before she said something that would create a diplomatic incident. She filed a note in the record that the Drac Federation had been aware of human activity for 4 years, had assessed them as a civilization approaching contact readiness on its own schedule, and had said nothing to the other major powers because it had assumed everyone else had reached the same conclusion. She filed a second note recommending that in future I assumed everyone already knew was not an acceptable standard for intelligence sharing between major galactic powers. On Earth, the news of the engagement traveled fast, not on any public channel, not at first. The Terran Defense Command knew before anyone else, because the reckoning had reported in real time, and TDC had been tracking the situation from the moment the Dominion patrol ship found them. Captain Chen's after-action report was thorough. She had logged every firing solution, every shield reading every tactical decision and the reasoning behind each one. She had noted the Dominion ship's weapon systems, assessed their effectiveness against reckoning defensive layers, and provided a calibrated estimate of what a larger Dominion force could have accomplished with more time. Her final assessment in the report was brief. It said the engagement was necessary, survivable, and within expected parameters. The Dominion now knows we are here and knows we are capable. The period of observation is over. Recommend immediate escalation to diplomatic track and full defensive posture across all patrol routes. She had appended one personal note. For the record, I gave them a warning. They had time to stand down. The Terran Defense Council met in emergency session 8 hours after the reckoning's report arrived. They met in a hardened facility under a city that most people on Earth thought housed a regional government office, because most of the people who needed to not know about TDC did not know about TDC. The council consisted of 12 members drawn from the world's major governments, military commands, and scientific agencies. They had been meeting in various forms for 28 years. They had overseen the construction of the fleet. They had set the patrol routes. They had written the doctrine that Captain Chin had applied in her engagement. They had also, 28 years ago, made the decision not to announce humanity's presence to the galactic community. Yet that decision had been made because 28 years ago they had read the galactic community's history and concluded that walking up to a galactic empire without a credible deterrent was a good way to become a subject people rather than an independent one. They had seen what the Dominion had done to 3 other species in the historical record. They had seen what the Keth Collective had done to 2 others. They had decided that the right time to introduce humanity to the galaxy was when humanity had something to back itself up with. They had spent 28 years building that something. The council chair, a woman named Director Yemi Akefer, looked around the table. The situation is clear, she said. Dominion knows we exist. They will be investigating. The observation period is over, whether we want it to be or not. She paused. The question before this council is, what do we do next? We go to them, said the military representative, Admiral Jawan Park. He said it without hesitation because he had thought about this moment for 16 years since he joined the council, and he had always believed the answer was the same. We go to them first on our terms. We set the conditions of first contact, not them, and if they respond militarily, asked the science representative, then we respond in kind, Admiral Park said. But they won't, not after the reckoning. They're smart enough to know what that engagement means. What does it mean? Asked the youngest member of the council, a diplomat named Elias Bergman, who had joined 2 years ago and was still occasionally surprised by the things he found himself discussing. Admiral Park looked at him. It means they sent 12 ships and got 11 of them wrecked in 11 minutes by one of ours, whatever they thought we were. Before that, they know now that we're not going to fold. They're going to want to talk. He leaned forward. Everyone who's ever been surprised by us has wanted to talk. After the first fight, it's consistent across every conflict in human history. You show someone you can hit back and they start looking for the table. Director Akafor nodded slowly. We prepare a diplomatic mission, full credentials, we approach the Dominion capital. She looked at Bergman. You've been reading their political structure. For 2 years, you know their protocols. You're leading the delegation. Bergman looked at her. I'm 34 years old. You're 34 years old and you're the best prepared diplomat we have for this specific task. She almost smiled. Also, they're going to expect us to send someone young. It'll unsettle them. Use that. Bergman thought about it for a moment. He thought about the reckoning and its captain who had given one warning and meant it. He thought about 12 warships. In a cloud of wreckage, he thought about a galactic empire that had looked at his species 61 years ago and written them off as primitive. All right, he said. But I want it on record that this was your idea. It always was, Director Akafor said. She looked at the rest of the table. We move quickly. We're not waiting for them to bring the conversation to us. We're going to them. And we're going professionally, and we're going with our full credentials, and we are going to make it very clear who they are dealing with. She paused. It is time, she said, to introduce ourselves properly. The human diplomatic vessel arrived at Veltion Prime 18 days after the engagement. It came alone, which the Dominion tracking stations noted with some relief, and it came on a direct heading toward the capital, which it transmitted openly on all frequencies, along with its identity, its origin, its crew manifest, and the diplomatic credentials of the mission leader. It did not attempt to surprise anyone. It did not arrive unannounced. It sent a message 3 days out requesting permission to enter Dominion space under diplomatic protocol, and it waited for the response before crossing the border. The response came from Admiral Southern personally. He had asked the Emperor for the authority to manage the initial approach, and the Emperor had given it. The message was simple: permission granted, an escort would be provided. Please hold current position until the escort arrives. The human vessel held position for 9 hours without complaint while the escort assembled 3 Dominion diplomatic cruisers, which were not warships but were large enough to make a statement. The humans did not comment on the 9-hour wait. They did not complain. They sent a brief acknowledgement and waited. Southern watched the waiting on the display and thought that he was already learning something. The human's vessel was smaller than the reckoning, much smaller. It was built in a completely different style, clean lines, less visible armor, no obvious weapon ports. It looked like what it was, a ship designed to carry people to meetings, not to fight. But even so, it was clearly built by the same minds. The whole geometry had the same underlying philosophy, and the sensor readings showed the same approach to systems design, compact and capable, nothing wasted. They had different ships for different purposes. That was itself a statement. Elias Bergman stood at the viewport of the diplomatic vessel Concordia and watched Veltion Prime get larger as they made their approach under escort. It was a large planet, dense with city light on the night side and broad with color on the day side, older than Earth geologically speaking, with smaller oceans and larger plains, the kind of world that had been inhabited long enough to show it. He had studied this planet for 2 years. He had read everything the observation teams had recorded. He knew the capital city by sight, knew the palace complex from aerial scans taken by surveillance satellites that the Dominion did not no existed. He knew the Emperor's name, and his history and his reputation. He was still nervous. He was 34 years old, and he was about to walk into the throne room of the most powerful political entity in this part of the galaxy and tell them how things were going to work. He had spent 2 weeks on the ship. Preparing, he had rehearsed every possible version of this conversation. With the 3 advisors on his team, he had read every piece of Galactic diplomatic history he could find. He was still nervous. You look nervous, said Senior Advisor Dr. Amara Dial, appearing at his shoulder. I am nervous, Bergman said. I'm nervous in a healthy and appropriate way that will not affect my performance. Good, she said. That's the right kind of nervous. She looked at the planet. You know what they expect. He knew they expected either aggression or submission. Those were the 2 modes a newly encountered species usually operated in at first contact. Aggression was met with force. Submission was met with terms. Neither of those produced the outcome humanity needed. They're going to get neither, he said. No. Dr. Diallo agreed. They're going to get you. The meeting was held in a formal reception chamber that was clearly designed to be impressive. High ceilings, elaborate materials, the kind of room that said without words that the power sitting across from you was very old and very sure of itself. Bergman walked in and looked at it and thought it was a very nice room. He sat down at the table across from Admiral Sothvin, who was representing the Emperor for the initial session, and the Dominion's chief diplomatic officer, a tall and careful individual named Velzon, who had clearly done his own preparation. There were advisors on both sides. There was a team of translators, though the human delegation had their own translation system, and both sides had agreed to run both simultaneously as a cross-check. Velzon opened. He expressed the Dominion's interest in establishing formal communication. He expressed regret that the initial contact had occurred in an unplanned manner. He expressed a desire to understand the full scope of the situation before any formal positions were taken. He said nothing about the battle group. Bergman noted that carefully. He let Velzon finish and then he spoke. Thank you, he said. I appreciate the welcome, and I want to be straightforward with you about why I'm here and what I'd like to accomplish. He paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing his words. Exactly. The Terran Defense Command has been monitoring this region for approximately 30 years. During that time, we made a decision not to initiate formal contact with any recognized galactic power. That decision was made because we wanted to ensure that when we did make contact, we were doing so as an equal party, not as a dependent one. Velzon said carefully, you have been present in this region for 30 years without making yourself known. Yes, Bergman said simply. We were not ready to be known yet, and now you ours. Now we are. He looked at Sothvin. I want to acknowledge the engagement with your battle group directly, because not acknowledging it would be dishonest, and I think we'll work better together. If we're honest, Captain Shan was within her authority to defend her vessel when your ships fired on her. She gave a warning before the engagement. She followed Terran Defense Command engagement rules, which require minimum necessary force and which specifically prohibit targeting crew spaces or causing unnecessary casualties. He paused. Your ships are Recoverable, your people who were aboard. Those ships are alive. That was a deliberate choice. Sothan looked at him. You're telling me that the outcome of that battle was controlled. I'm telling you that Captain Shan had options she chose not to use. Bergman said, I think you already suspected that. Sothan had suspected exactly that. He had watched Drethan's combat record many times and had noticed the same thing that Drethan had noticed. The Reckoning had not tried to destroy his ships, only to stop them. That restraint had a meaning, and now he was sitting across from a 34-year-old human diplomat who was explaining it to him directly. What do you want? Velson asked. It was blunt for a diplomatic opening, but Velson was a practical man who had gotten tired of circumlocution somewhere around his 30th year in the diplomatic service. Bergman almost smiled. He liked practical men. Recognition, formal acknowledgement by the Dominion that the Terran Republic is a sovereign entity with full standing in galactic political affairs, and agreement on border boundaries that reflects actual human patrol coverage, not assumed dominion territory, and a mutual non-aggression framework that we can both live with. Long term, he said nothing about the fleet. He did not mention the shipyards. He did not give numbers or capabilities. He did not need to. The engagement with the battle group had already said everything that needed to be said about what happened when you fired on a human ship. That is a significant set of demands, Velson said. They're not demands, Bergman said. They're the terms of a working relationship. We want a working relationship. We have no interest in conflict with the Dominion. We have been sitting in this part of space for 30 years without harming anyone, and we intend to continue in that way. He looked at Velson steadily. But we are here. We are not going away, and we are capable of defending our interests. What we're offering is a way to do this that works for everyone instead of a way that works for nobody. The room was quiet. Sothan looked at the young diplomat and thought that he had underestimated several things in the past month, and that this young man was now one more thing he was going to have to add to that list. He was young and he was nervous. Sothan could see the nerves. He had spent 32 years learning to read rooms, but the nerves were underneath something steady, and the something steady was not arrogance. It was not the bravado of someone who knew they had won a fight and was enjoying it. It was the steady quality of someone who had a job and intended to do it properly. I will convey your position to the Emperor, Velson said. We will need time to consider. Of course, Bergman said. We're not in a hurry. The Emperor received Velson's report that evening. He asked several questions. He sat with the answers for a while. Then he asked for Quarla to be brought to his study. She arrived and sat, and he did not waste time. They want recognition, he said. Sovereign status, border agreement, non-aggression framework. Yes, Quarla said. She had received her own briefing. Is there a version of this where we refuse? There is always a version of anything where we refuse, she said. Question is what follows the refusal. In this case, I think what follows is a long period of tension with a civilization we cannot locate fully, cannot assess fully, and cannot currently match in the specific type of engagement where they're strongest. She paused. We don't know where all their ships are. We don't know their full patrol coverage. We don't know Their communication networks, they've been watching us for 30 years. We've been watching them for 3 weeks. The Emperor nodded slowly. The young diplomat, he said, tell me about him. Elias Bergman, 34 years old, specialist in interspecies political theory. He has been studying Dominion history and political structure for 2 years. Specifically in preparation for this moment, he was selected for this mission, which means the humans decided their best option for this conversation was a scholar, not a soldier, which tells us something, the Emperor said. They want to talk, they didn't send someone to threaten us, they sent someone to negotiate. Korla looked at the Emperor. The battle group was not a threat, it was an answer to an attack. They are distinguishing between the two. The Emperor looked out the window of his study at the city below. He had been emperor for 40 years. He had inherited an empire that was stable, powerful and unchallenged. He had never faced a situation quite like this one. He thought about what it meant that a species had watched his empire for 30 years and said nothing. He thought about what it meant that they had built warships in silence for decades. He thought about what it meant that when they finally sent someone to talk, they sent a young diplomat who said, "We're not in a hurry," and meant it. They were patient. They were very, very patient. And they were not afraid. "We will negotiate," he said. "We will take their terms seriously, and we will produce a counter-offer that gives us something to work with. We will not insult them by offering less than they deserve, and we will not give away more than we must." He paused. "Treat them as a major power, because that is what they are." Cordelia nodded. She had been hoping he would reach this conclusion. She had written her reports toward this conclusion. She was pleased. She was about to leave when the Emperor spoke again. "One more thing, the question I cannot answer." He looked at her. "Why now? They were ready years ago from the evidence. They could have come to us. Then, why wait until the reckoning was found?" Cordelia had thought about this question too. She had turned it over many times. "I think," she said slowly, "that they were never waiting for a specific capability level. I think we're waiting for certainty. Certainty that comes from watching a thing long enough to understand it. They studied us until they felt they understood us completely. And then they wanted a test." She paused. "They wanted to know what we'd do when we found one of their ships. Not what we said we'd do, what we actually did." The Emperor stared at her. "Reckoning," he said, "on a route that took it into our detection range. Patrol route that went just slightly deeper into our territory than their previous ones." "I don't know," Cordelia said honestly. "I can't know if that was deliberate, but it fits." The Emperor looked out at the city for a long time. "They let us find them," he said, "because they wanted to see what we'd do, and we sent 12 warships, and now they know." The room was very quiet. The negotiations took 11 days. There were points of difficulty. The border question was complicated because the Dominions claimed territory overlapped significantly with areas the humans had been quietly surveying, and in some cases using the non-aggression framework required careful language around what constituted an act of aggression and what constituted legitimate patrol activity. These were real issues that required real work from both sides. Bergman was in the negotiating room for most of those 11 days. He drank a great deal of the local equivalent of tea, which he found tolerable, and he ate unfamiliar food without complaint, and he asked questions that were specific and took notes that were thorough, and he did not bluff, and he did not grandstand, and he did not lose his patience when the Dominion side pushed back on points he had expected them to push back on. He was nervous for the first 2 days. After that, he was not nervous anymore, because after 2 days he had a clear sense of who he was dealing with and what they wanted, and what they wanted was not so different from what anyone wanted: stability, respect, and an arrangement they could explain to their own people as acceptable. He could work with that. On the 11th day, both sides signed a framework document. It was not a final treaty that would take months more, with larger delegations and more technical working groups, but it was a framework, a foundation, a mutual acknowledgement that the Terran Republic and the Veth Dominion were both real, both present, and both going to have to share the same part of the galaxy. When the signing was done, Velzen looked at Bergman across the table. He had, over 11 days, come to a grudging professional respect for the young human. He was not going to say that out loud, but he thought it. "You said you weren't in a hurry," Velzen said. "We weren't." Bergman agreed. "You had the fleet, you had the capability, you could have announced yourselves at any point. Why 30 years?" Bergman looked at him. "Because walking into a room and announcing yourself works better when people already know what you're capable of, and because knowing what you're capable of requires watching you for a while." He paused. "We wanted to understand who we were dealing with before we introduced ourselves." "And what did you conclude?" Velzen asked. "After 30 years of watching us," Bergman thought about it honestly, "that you're a serious power that does serious things." He said. "That you have a long history and strong institutions, and you generally try to do things properly." He looked at Velzen directly. "And that you would have treated us as a subject people if we come to you before we were ready. You would have meant well, probably, but you would have done it." Velzen did not argue. He was a diplomatic officer of 30 years experience, and he knew his empire's history, and now he said, "Now we're ready." Bergman said simply, "And so you won't." On the ESV Reckoning 3 weeks after the engagement, Captain Yara Chen received the first summary briefing from the diplomatic mission. She read it in her cabin with a cup of coffee and the quiet of a ship that was back on patrol. A different route this time, better mapped, properly documented. The new framework. She read about the framework agreement. She read about the 11 days. She read about the young diplomat and the Dominion Emperor in the negotiations. She put the briefing down and drank her coffee. Her communications officer knocked and came in. "Captain, message from TDC." She took it. Rated was a commendation for the engagement. Formally entered into record. Appropriate conduct under fire, minimum necessary force, restraint consistent with doctrine. She filed it. Then she pulled up her after-action report, the one she had written 3 weeks ago, and read the last line she had written. "For the record, I gave them a warning. They had time to stand down." She read it once. Then she closed the file and went back to her patrol. The Reckoning moved through space that was, for the first time in human history, mapped and recognized, and officially the territory of a sovereign people, a people that had spent 30 years being patient, a people that had spent those same years building ships and training crews and studying the galaxy until they understood it well, enough to enter it on their own terms. The stars were the same as they had always been. The humans were at last among them, and the galaxy, for its part, was learning something important. The quiet ones were worth paying attention to, the ones who took their time and said nothing for 30 years and then showed up with a framework agreement and a diplomatic team and a fleet that nobody had seen coming. Those ones you treated with respect from the very beginning, because by the time they introduced themselves, they had already decided exactly who they were. And they were not asking for anyone's permission to be it.